So I was recently contacted by someone who I haven't seen or spoken with in several years. This was someone who had long ago taken advantage of me, of my kindness, my vulnerability, and so on through a kind of emotional manipulation. And this was something that had gone on for a couple of years, but it took me that long just to realize it. And when I eventually did, I decided to walk away and never look back. And letting that person go felt liberating and empowering, but I also came away from that relationship feeling deeply hurt. I felt misled, used, mistreated by someone who I had cared about, someone who I had opened myself up to, someone who was supposed to be a friend, someone I had done so much for, who I had given so much of my time and energy to, who I had gone out of my way for many times, and who had really done little more than take advantage of the situation. And even though I finally had the wisdom to walk away, I was carrying with me a lot of resentment. How could I forgive this person? Did they even deserve my forgiveness? Why should I forgive them? My decision to cut them out of my life was because I no longer saw any reason to remain connected, and I didn't want to make myself available to their manipulation. I was done with that. I needed time and space away from them in order to heal, in order to process all of this, in order to let go and move on with my life. I had no idea what impact my decision had on them. I didn't know if they felt bad about it. I didn't know if they were reflecting on what they had done, on how they had treated me. I didn't know if they felt any remorse at all. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they were totally unfazed by it. Maybe they would never own up to their bullshit. Maybe they weren't even aware of it. I really had no idea what might have been going on in their mind. Often, when we harbor resentment towards someone, it's as if we're trying to punish them, wanting them to suffer. But in reality, it's we that suffer. This person was probably unaware of all the anger and bitterness and frustration that I was feeling, primarily because I never told them. I had just walked away without saying a word. There was so much that I needed to process at the time, to make sense of, that I'm not sure I would have been able to clearly articulate it. But even if I had told them, I'm not sure that it would have really made much difference. Sometimes you don't want to tell someone what they did because you want them to acknowledge it themselves on their own. You want them to reflect on their behavior, on the relationship, to figure it out on their own. It has far more value if they can do this. And if they can't, then the very fact that they can't or won't acknowledge it is all the more reason not to want to engage with them. Even when we do express our hurt or tell the other person how they mistreated us, it may not have much effect on them. There are some people who are simply not willing to take responsibility for their behavior. They find some way to rationalize it or to interpret it in a way that absolves them of responsibility. They may refuse to acknowledge having done anything wrong or diminish the severity of the issue. They may even try to turn it back around on you to suggest that it's somehow your fault, or to completely project the transgression onto you. And this can cause us to become even more resentful. The point is that this resentment is not guaranteed to disturb that person, to punish them, to provoke them to reflect upon themselves or to change their ways. But it is guaranteed to create a disturbance in us. It is certain that our resentment causes us to suffer. It eats us up inside, eroding away at any happiness we have. And if we go on waiting for someone else to apologize in order that we can move on, we could go on waiting forever. And so I realized that I needed to resolve this within myself on my own, to let it go, not so much for their sake, but for my own, so that I could be free of it, so that I could get on with my life. So the first thing that we have to understand about forgiveness is that we need to forgive for our own sake, for our own peace of mind. And all that forgiveness really means is to let go of resentment. It has nothing to do with excusing the other person, with condoning their behavior or permitting it to continue. It really has very little to do with the other person at all. But it has everything to do with freeing yourself from that burden of bitterness. This person who had taken advantage of me so long ago would contact me once in a while, and I would simply ignore their messages. I hadn't closed myself off entirely from the possibility of reconciliation, but it was going to require them to take responsibility for their behavior, to own up to their transgression, and to offer a sincere apology. And so recently, after a number of years, they contacted me again, and in the message they had expressed a desire for reconciliation. But I found their message lacking, as usual, in accountability. There was no acknowledgement of what they had done. There was no apology. And the thing is that reconciliation can only happen when there's a sincere apology. A sincere apology requires 3 elements. First, there's the acknowledgement of what that person did. Second is the acknowledgement that it was inconsiderate or selfish or hurtful. And third, there is the sincere desire to correct themselves so that it doesn't happen again. And if any of these elements are missing from the equation, then the apology is incomplete. Quite often, a person will not offer such an apology if they offer one at all. Sometimes a person may apologize, but without any acknowledgement of what they did, which suggests that they don't even know what they're apologizing for. Or they may acknowledge what they did, but they may not acknowledge why it was wrong. Or they may acknowledge that it was wrong, but somehow minimalize it or rationalize it in some way, or simply make no effort at all to correct themselves, which means they'll likely do it again. In each of these situations, reconciliation is not possible because there needs to be a solid foundation upon which to rebuild whatever trust was broken. And how can you even begin to trust someone who has not offered up a sincere apology, who does not seem to be truly remorseful and committed to change? If they're unwilling to acknowledge their wrongdoing, then how can there ever be any trust? So how do we forgive such a person? How do we forgive someone who can't even offer a sincere apology, or who offers no apology at all? Often we find forgiveness so challenging because we have so many misconceptions about it. We think that forgiveness is something that we give to the other, and in some cases it might be to some extent, but primarily it's something that we do for ourselves. And it's not so much about giving something, but about getting rid of the resentment, letting it go so that you can be free of it, so that you can be at peace. This means that you can forgive someone without actually telling them. And you can forgive someone without accepting their apology if it happens to be that the apology is insincere. Or if you never even receive an apology, you can still forgive. And you can also forgive someone without reconciliation. That means you don't have to try and restore the relationship. You don't have to keep them in your life. You don't have to associate with them. You don't have to give them any of your time or attention. You can forgive them and still walk away. Often people confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. And this is why a person will often ask for forgiveness. What they're usually really asking for is reconciliation, which means to restore the relationship. But if the relationship has become fractured because that person was disrespectful or inconsiderate or selfish or whatever it happens to be, then that needs to be addressed and resolved in order for that relationship to be healed. And if that person is not willing to work to resolve that, then there's not going to be any restoration. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean that you can trust them again. Forgiveness and trust are two separate issues. Forgiveness we can offer up freely, but trust is something to be earned. And if that person has broken that trust, it's up to them to earn it back. And that may require more effort than most are willing to give. I've learned throughout my life that people seldom change their ways. Every person is capable of changing, but few ever do. And I've also learned that those who don't take responsibility for their behavior, who don't acknowledge it, are incapable of changing. Because change requires, first of all, that you acknowledge what needs to be changed. If you can't even acknowledge it, then how can you do anything to resolve it? I've also observed that many who do not take responsibility for their selfish behavior are often unaware of it, that it's often totally unconscious. They don't even realize that they're doing it. Or when it does begin to become apparent to them, they quickly divert their attention away from it. They make excuses, they rationalize it, they marginalize it, they minimalize it, they project it onto others. Anything to avoid looking directly at it and owning it. But at the same time, I've also come to understand that no one is intrinsically evil. And that is, this selfish and inconsiderate behavior arises from their own personal issues, their own insecurities, their own internal conflict, and so on. Which is to say that deep down, they're disturbed by something. There's some underlying discomfort. Often that person is deeply hurting, and all of that suffering clouds their ability to recognize how their behavior affects others. It clouds their ability to truly consider the other and to behave with consideration, with compassion, and with kindness. When I'm able to recognize that deep beneath all the bullshit this person is hurting, I find that I have compassion for them. And where there is compassion, resentment begins to dissolve. And when I say compassion, again, I don't mean that I excuse their behavior, nor condone it, nor allow them to continue to treat me with disrespect. I simply mean that within myself, I feel compassion, while at the same time, I still exercise caution, even if that means completely cutting off contact. And by the way, there is nothing wrong with cutting contact with someone who has shown themselves over and over again to be inconsiderate or abusive or what have you, especially if they show no remorse and no likelihood of ever changing their behavior. In fact, you owe it to yourself to do that. And I know that some people can be really manipulative. They might try to appease you with an insincere apology, or they might try to guilt trip you, or get you to feel sorry for them, or tell you how much they need you, or whatever it happens to be. And if you're someone who's very kind-hearted, who's very generous, you might feel moved to give into that. But the way that manipulation works is that it plays on that sort of thing, on your kindness, on your generosity, and so on. So just be very aware of that. Be aware not merely of that person's manipulation techniques. Be also aware of what causes you to be susceptible to it. Find within you the strength and self-respect not to give into it. So again, when I say that I feel compassion for the person, I'm making a distinction between the person and their behavior or character or what have you. I recognize that there are characteristics about their personality which are selfish or harmful or toxic, but I also recognize that beneath all of that is someone who is hurting, who is perhaps insecure in themselves, who doesn't really know any better. And I can feel sympathy for that person. But because of their behavior, I'm still not going to allow them a space in my life. Now, forgiveness can take a long time. There may be a lot to process. It may even take many years. But I found that there is one final step to all of this that really seals it, that really resolves it in oneself. It may not resolve it in the relationship because, again, that would require the other person owning up to their bullshit. It just means that we can resolve the resentment within ourselves. We can not only heal our own wounds, but we can rise out of this whole thing stronger and wiser than before. This final step is about learning and growing from the experience and finding gratitude in that. When I found myself feeling resentful toward this particular person, it was because they had been taking advantage of me during our entire relationship through a kind of emotional manipulation. And initially I was angry with them because of this, but as I explored my resentment more deeply, I came to realize that a lot of it was actually directed at myself. I was angry with myself for having been such a fool, for having allowed myself to be manipulated and taken advantage of. And so I had to ask myself why. Why had I allowed myself to be so susceptible? And looking deeply into this, I found that it was my own insecurities, my own illusions, my own attachments and expectations. And with this understanding, I was able to begin resolving these things within myself. I was able to eventually overcome them, which naturally made me immune to that sort of manipulation. By overcoming these insecurities, I was able to discover my inner strengths. I was able to love myself more deeply, to respect myself enough not to allow others to take advantage of me. I was learning to become more emotionally independent, to let go of attachments and expectations, to recognize and honor the value in myself without the need for validation from others. The more that I looked into my own discomfort, my own resentment, my own disappointment in regard to this situation, the more there was to learn and to grow from, to discover about myself. And by seeing the entire situation as a valuable lesson which had contributed to that growth, I was able to find gratitude in that. If it hadn't been for that situation, for that person showing up in my life as they had, I would not have learned any of this. I would not have grown as I have. I would not be as strong and secure as I am today. And so I have profound gratitude for that experience and everything that it has taught me. And this gratitude was helping me to release the last of that resentment so that I could be at peace within myself. And so I came to see this other person as quite possibly one of the greatest spiritual teachers in my life, because I would have never learned all of these things merely from reading books or attending lectures. In fact, I already had a fairly good intellectual understanding of all of this. What I didn't have was an experiential understanding, which is much deeper. And not to say that I would ever tell this person that I'm grateful for them having come into my life to teach me this very difficult lesson, because likely it would just feed their ego. And they would probably misinterpret it, thinking that I'm grateful for some profound wisdom that they had shared or some kindness that they had offered me. They probably never recognized that it was their own selfishness, their own lack of respect, their own foolishness and delusion that encouraged me to grow. So just take what you can from that experience and move forward in your life. This entire process is for you, so that you can learn and grow from it, so that you can let go of it, so that you can find peace in all of it. That's what forgiveness is. It's the relinquishing of resentment in order to free yourself from that suffering. We forgive not so that the other is absolved, but so that we can be at peace. If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.